Welcome everyone to this webinar on the nature future scenarios for Europe. I am Carlo Rondinini from Sapienza University of Rome, part of the NaturaConnect team and leading the development of the storylines for the nature futures for Europe. You will learn more about the nature futures in the first part of the webinar, and more on the applications for Europe in the second part, which will be more interactive. But I just wanted to tell you that this webinar is part of a broader stakeholder consultation that we are doing to develop these scenarios as part of this Horizon Europe project. I'll start with a few housekeeping rules. This session is being recorded, and we will send you the recording at the end of the webinar. You can start your video at your convenience if you want, but you don't have to. So you can keep your video off if you prefer. But in any case, it would be important for us to be able to identify people, so make sure that the name that appears under your picture or in your box in Zoom displays correctly your name and institution. We have two ways of interacting in this webinar. For general comments, please use the Zoom chat box, and we welcome your thoughts in general. For questions to the panel, to the speakers that you will hear today, please use the question and answer box that is in the tool there, both in the bottom toolbar. You will have a Q&A and a chat. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat for the comments. Finally, I'll ask you to please remain muted during the presentations. This is the agenda for today's webinar. You will hear, first of all, presentations on the NaturaConnect project itself, and on the Nature Future framework that has been developed under the auspices of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and a presentation on how we plan to use the Nature Future scenarios within the context of NaturaConnect. Then we will have a short questions and answers session, a short break, and this will be followed by a session on the draft nature future narratives that have been developed so far with some stakeholder consultation already. You will hear more about it. And then we'll allow more time for questions and comments specifically on the European nature future narratives. And finally, some conclusive remarks. For the interaction, we will use Mentimeter, and we will start now. To use Mentimeter, you can follow the link that has been pasted in the chat, and enter the code that has been pasted in the chat as well. So you can go to menti.com and then enter the code. The code should also be available now. I should be able to show you the code. Nope. Am I? Yes. This is the code that you can enter in menti.com. And you can start with this very simple question, that is, what country are you joining this webinar from? Right, seems to be working now. We have good representation from all across Europe. I see a little more of Netherlands, Germany, but Belgium, Portugal, Denmark, Italy, Austria, Spain, Romania, and Ukraine, Ireland. Really a good representation, I would say. That's good. That's good. Thanks. I will move on then into the following questions. Thank you. So it should be the question here. What type of organization do you represent? We already have several answers to these questions. So we have a majority of research institutes, universities, but also a fairly good representation of non-governmental organizations. European Union, European Community institutions, also national governments here, and yeah, subnational, at least one subnational. So we seem to have private sector, protected areas. We have a higher representation of research institutions, but really, again, at least some representatives from many sectors, which is also very good for us. Thank you. And I will move on to the last question from my side. Nature conservation, social science, spatial planning. Forestry is growing. Good. Well, lots of nature conservation as expected, but also lots of spatial planning, which is an important component for us, as well as social science, forestry, various other sectors, urban. Here again, maybe some underrepresented, apparently, mining, infrastructure, but otherwise at least one, or in many cases more representatives from the various sectors. All right, thank you. Okay, thanks for answering these first questions. Hopefully this has solved all the technical problems that we had at the beginning. We'll use Menti a lot more during the webinar, and we can now move on to the first presentation by Jutta Beher from the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna, who will introduce the NaturaConnect project. Please, Jutta.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jutta. I'm very excited to see so many people interested in what we're doing, and so I will give you a super brief rundown about the spatial planning aspect of NaturaConnect, designing a trans-European nature network. So. Try to have access to the screen. There it goes. So I give you first a very brief policy context. What this is actually about. So there is something that's called the Biodiversity Strategy 2030, in which the different member states of the European Union have committed to specific objectives. So one of these is to legally protect at least 30% of land, including inland waters, and 30% of the sea in the European Union. And at least 1/3 of this, so 10% of the total land, should be strictly protected. And there is already a network of protected areas in Europe. You can see there the map in green, and this covers currently about 25% of the land. So the big mission is now to identify 5 additional %, of Europe to add to this network that could provide the biggest benefit for biodiversity while not causing too much pain for human societies. And there's also another commitment that is about including restoration on 20% of land that has the overall objective of leading to good ecological condition. And then there's also a commitment to facilitate ecological corridors and support sustainable land management while increasing resilience through climate mitigation and adaptation. So it means these final network of protected areas should be able to connect the different protected areas and also have some type of climate proofness when the climate is changing. So to do that work and find these best additional places, we have a consortium of 22 organizations, like 15 research organizations and 7 are national agencies and conservation NGOs located in different countries of the European Union. And one aspect of the project is to develop like 6 case studies across different scales, in addition to a European-wide prioritization plan. And one of the core ambitions of NaturaConnect is to not do that in academic silos, but to engage in co-creation and talk to key decision makers and stakeholders so that the knowledge and tools and capacity building that we provide is actually supporting the European member states when they try to realize an ecologically representative, resilient and well-connected network of protected areas. So to give you an idea of what type of outputs we produce, I present you 3 key outputs that among like many other things that we're working on. And the first one is to define a blueprint of the network of connected areas that addresses gaps in coherence and ecological representativeness. So that means that we will provide spatial priorities for national and international designations to support planning of the conservation network and reduce conservation gaps, so that we pay a special attention to these species and habitats that are currently maybe underrepresented. And then we also try to propose a method for monitoring and reporting of the 10N performance so that we can actually say if the protected areas will achieve what they're supposed to do. And this prioritization works as a stepwise approach, so like it's a bit of a decision-making strategy. So that in the first step, we collect and prepare a set of data. In the second step, we identify very clear objectives, what we want to achieve for biodiversity, but also for human societies. Then we run a spatial prioritization with computer algorithms to find like these areas in Europe that could provide the best benefits with the least associated negative impacts, and combine this with land use scenarios and forecasted like land use and climate changes in Europe. And this finally produces then a spatial explicit map of priority areas that could be not only used as a sort of aid for member states when they come up with their own plans, but also as a European-wide like benchmark where member states can see like how close do they get to what is actually possible and as a like best practice scenario. Then a second important output is to support protecting and restoring multifunctional corridors across spatial scales and enhancing connectivity. So this is again, you can imagine like a map that will make it very visible, like how these different protected areas will be connected through Europe and through countries and different regions. So we will be providing guidelines, data and tools for connectivity conservation for the designation of corridors from local to pan-European scales. And conservation and restoration priorities will also increase the resilience of the network. So you can imagine when animals can move through space and leave one protected area to get to the next, it will be easier for them to react to pressures that come up. And then lastly, but not least, we also review best spatial planning practices and funding mechanisms, engage stakeholders, co-design tools and guidelines, and try to maximize uptake. So in short, we try to talk to people. And one of the things that we do that I already mentioned is to work in these like 6 case studies where we work closely with management authorities in these regions and countries. And on top of that, we provide spatial planning tools. We work on a stakeholder and member database to put people in touch with each other and in touch with us. And we will be providing a NaturaConnect learning platform where member states will finally be able to use the tools that we produce and run their own analysis. And we also provide financial support and best practices policy guidelines. So that was a super brief overview. And if you want to learn more about NaturaConnect, just Google us, and we have a website where you can find more details. And so I hand over back to Carlo.
Thank you, Jutta, for this introduction. We will move now on to the presentation of the Nature Future Framework by Enric Pereira from the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research in Leipzig. Please, Enric.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody if you are in European time. So I'm going to talk to you about the main topic of today, that is the nature future scenarios. The nature future scenarios try to address this issue, that is, how can we bend the curve of biodiversity loss? It has become apparent in the last few years that continuing the trajectory of biodiversity loss is not sustainable, and we need to go beyond previous commitments that only aimed at reducing the rate of loss to bend the curve, to have positive visions for the future of nature. And this is what the nature future scenarios development is about developing scenarios that go beyond the traditional exploratory scenarios that typically paint different negative prospects for the future of the planet, to move towards the design of scenarios that portray desirable futures for nature. So this work started a few years ago in IPBES, in the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity Ecosystem Services. There was an assessment on scenarios and models that concluded that these existing scenarios didn't really explore the space to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and that we needed a new generation of scenarios that modeled multiple system components of socio-ecological systems that addressed multiple temporal and spatial scales. And so a task force was established under IPBES to start developing, or let's say, trigger the community, scientific community, to develop nature future scenarios. And the task force developed what is now called the Nature Future Framework. It is a framework to develop these scenarios, where we identified three main perspectives that people have about the relationship of people and nature. Nature for nature is a perspective that is dominated by ideas such as ecological integrity, wilderness, land sparing, nature for itself, space for nature. Nature for society, that is associated with ideas such as ecosystem services, natural capital, bioeconomy, sustainable use. And nature as culture, that is associated with perspectives where there's not really a separation between nature and people. People is part of nature, nature are part of people. Ideas such as Mother Earth, one with nature, it's an alternative name for this perspective. Cultural landscapes, and so on. And you could plot different axes here where you could represent people's preferences for nature in a triangle, where, for instance, the importance of culture in shaping landscapes axis, the importance of instrumental values is another axis that has a high value nature for society and lower value nature for nature and nature as culture. And the idea of autonomy of nature, nature for itself, that has a high value in nature for nature and a lower value in nature as culture and nature for society. But this doesn't capture, let's say, the temporal trajectories of ecosystems fully. For that, you need to go into a three-dimensional representation of these three different axes. And suppose that we are in the red dot here in this three-dimensional space. In the past, we were somewhere in a better situation in this gray dot, but then there's been degradation of nature in these three axes of nature for nature, nature as culture, nature as society. And now we want to move towards positive futures where we improve across these three aspects of our relationship with nature. And as we improve across these three axes, maybe then we reach some kind of frontier where you can only improve one of the axes at the cost of decreasing the other. And that's what we call the nature features frontier, and that you can see that as a triangle where if you move in one of the axes, you are changing the other three perspectives. But overall, we hope that we can improve in all three perspectives in the nature features, but with an emphasis in one of them. Now, we've been working on developing these multi-scale, multi-temporal scenarios, both in the task force and now more recently in NaturaConnect, where we're looking at this at European continental scales, and we'll be also looking at subglobal scales in Europe. And we started really with a consultation with a visioning exercise for how these nature features could be in Europe. And we draft some narratives based on that visioning that we are now submitting to consultation by stakeholders. Then we'll do modeling of those narratives refined by this consultation that we are taking. And then we'll refine the narratives around again and do again stakeholder consultation, and hopefully still have another round of possibilities for modeling and analysis of the scenarios. And the result will be these nature feature scenarios that we'll have in our case for Europe, but also across sectors, urban, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and so on. Let me just illustrate how we're doing that very briefly in the next two slides. So the first idea is that we come up with some kind of visions or ideas of how these nature features should be in different sectors in Europe. Here, for instance, we have visions for cities, for urban systems. In Nature for Nature, the idea is to have very compact cities, that you minimize your footprint to nature, but you still can try to, let's say, connect natural areas through cities. In Nature for Society, there is a big emphasis on nature-based solutions in cities to regulate local climate, to provide opportunities for recreation, to produce food, and etc. And in Nature as Culture, there is a big emphasis in the relationship between people and nature. And here we have ideas such as like community gardens or urban gardening as an activity that connects people with nature in cities, and many other aspects of, let's say, cultural landscapes that you could have in cities, like botanical gardens in the cities. Now, we can discuss these narratives, but then we have to model to see if our assumptions about how these narratives work really are reasonable. And to model, we have to look at different components of socio-ecological systems. And here I wanted to highlight that there is a difference in the modeling of nature features and in the modeling of, for instance, other exploratory scenarios, such as the shared socioeconomic pathways. In the shared socioeconomic pathways that are, for instance, the scenarios that are used as underpinning much of the modeling work by the climate community, we just explore what are uncertainties about societal development and model different possible trajectories for socioeconomic development. In contrast, in the nature features, we have a vision. We have some kind of normative vision of where we're going to go, and we try to model how can we reach that vision. And that vision requires interventions on indirect drivers and direct drivers of ecosystem change. That's the left part of the diagram in green, that will influence biodiversity or nature and nature contributions to people and quality of life. And what we explore in the nature features is these three perspectives. In NaturaConnect, we're exploring only three scenarios that are at the extreme of this perspective. So a nature for nature scenario, a nature as cultural scenario, and a nature for society scenario, to provide really contrasting alternatives. And these three, let's say, scenarios correspond to a different set of interventions in drivers of ecosystem change and will result in different conditions for biodiversity and ecosystem services. All of them positive, but all of them correspond to slightly different values. And this is the exercise we're doing here today in terms of elaborating a bit more on these narratives per sector. So the first part of the exercise that then will be uptaken by the modeling. And I hand over now to Peter Verburg. Yep.
Thank you very much, Henrik. So these nature future scenarios that we are developing, and after in the second part of this webinar, we will work together on further elaborating those storylines. But when we have them in this NaturaConnect project, how are we going to use those storylines? So before we further develop them, we want to show you a little bit of how we're going to use it. So that's the part of this short explanation. So let me go to the next slide. So basically what we do in this project is trying to develop a protected area network that is resilient in different future conditions. And while it's traditional in those scenario context to capture those uncertainties, normally we especially look at big drivers like the demographic changes, changes in crop yields, changes in dietary changes, big changes in policies, or we look at the policy targets itself, like planting 3 billion trees, no net loss of natural areas, protection of 30% of land, like those policy targets that are part of the European Green Deal or the Convention of Biological Diversity. But what is often not addressed in those scenarios is another component, which is also pretty uncertain. That component is basically, that component is basically on what are our relational values to nature. Because in the end, the way we interact with nature under those large contextual changes depend on how the landscape will be changing and how the functioning will be changing. So that's exactly what this Nature Futures framework will capture, because different landscape configurations are able to meet the same societal and sustainability objectives. But different ways in how we interact with nature lead to a different prioritization of landscape locations and landscape features within that landscape. So the Nature Futures scenario offers that lens to have these different relational values with nature. So as an example, if we talk about what are priority locations for new protected areas, under a nature for nature scenario, you can imagine that priorities will be set to preserve as many species as possible. Well, in a nature for society scenario, securing the provisioning of ecosystem services for humans to benefit from nature could be a very important priority in that one, while nature as culture might focus on preserving cultural landscapes. So all three of those scenarios, they aim at creating additional protected areas, but where and what type of areas are selected depends on the relational values we set with nature. So that's why it's so important to have this framework as a basis for our NaturaConnect project. How is the workflow in the project? So at the moment, we are using this Nature Futures framework as a basis for elaborating the framework for European land use. What do these relational values to nature mean for European land use? We had a few months ago a workshop with stakeholders, and now there's this webinar to get your input on the first version of the narratives that will be presented hereafter. When we have those consolidated, we'll try to translate those in quantitative indicators and constraints that are an input to modeling. What is the workflow of modeling in the NaturaConnect project? We have 3 types of analysis that involve some modeling in the project. We have land use models, connectivity analysis and modeling, and we have a prioritization of the nature network. And all 3 are interconnected. Changes in land use will determine what are priority areas for nature. If cities expand, those areas might not be suitable for a protected area anymore, or they might be exactly the case to protect a valuable natural area if the city is getting too close. Land use changes affect the connectivity, and at the same time the connectivity changes affect where prioritization of a nature network should take place. So we're doing these 3 types of modeling, and all 3 of them are fed in with these nature futures storylines. And these nature future storylines, these relational values, are embedded in between large global macro scale context as captured in the SSP scenarios and a context of the changing climate. So if we go to the land use models, for that land use modeling, we will use the Clue-Mondo model. And the Clue-Mondo model will be using global scenarios. And given that this is a bright future, we'll base ourselves on this SSP1 scenario, and we'll use the pressures and the demands for wood, annual crops, permanent crops, but also for housing that are simulated by global scale trade models such as GloBiome. At the same time, we'll feed the model with a lot of spatial settings. And partly these reflect like suitabilities that are determined by climate scenarios, but also a lot of rules that are determined by the way we will interact with nature. Do we want to have nature at locations that provide a lot of recreation opportunities, or do we especially protect nature at locations with a high species richness, or do we want to have both in equal ways? So that's all input to a land system change module that calculates land use changes based on those scenario settings. To give you some example of how we translate these storylines to scenario settings, you here see a couple of examples. For each of these nature future scenarios, we can indicate which ecosystem services, nature's contribution to people are prioritized, what type of agricultural management might link to those storylines, what kind of agri-environmental measures are taken, and how urban futures may look like. So these are elements of a storyline for different scenarios that are then translated to maps that are used as preferences in this modeling framework. And those things can differ a lot in terms of spatial allocation. Here you see from another study an example of what are priority locations for protecting nature if you would focus on regulating ecosystem services, the blue locations. If you would focus on species, the orange locations, and the yellowish locations indicate if you would prioritize cultural landscapes for protection. And we only see that a very small fraction of landscapes in Europe would be prioritized for all 3 of these different priorities. So this is just an illustration how different values in what is important for protection can lead to very different priorities in the landscape. This is an example from a preliminary run of our modeling framework of how then these land use changes might look like for nature, for nature as culture, or for nature for society. And what we see from these preliminary runs are basically already very different configurations of the landscapes in Europe. Well, of course, the overall generic patterns remain. These land use model results feed into the connectivity analysis, but they also provide a context for the prioritization of the nature network. And priorities for the nature network, of course, affect other land uses. So in that sense, there's an iterative approach in the project. For the prioritization of the network itself, the land use change context and the connectivity context are inputs, as well as the priorities derived from the storylines in terms of the ecosystem services, in terms of the types of species, but also in the acceptable costs of designing a network. And together, by using those elements from the storylines, we can work towards an improved and more resilient network design that takes account of these alternative plural values that we have with nature. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We have now a short slot for questions, but no questions in the Q&A box. So if there are no questions at the moment, I would just call for the 5 minutes break. Yeah, you can add your questions meanwhile if you like, and we will answer the questions at the end of the second half of the session. So see you at 2:45. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Very short call for break, but we have an intense second part of the webinar. We will now enter into the details of the development of the nature future narratives for Europe with Claudia Fornarini and Alessandra D'Alessio from Sapienza University and Nestor Fernandez from the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. They will present the draft narratives that we developed in a first stakeholder workshop that we held in May in Leipzig. And what we will do through the questions that they will ask you is to try to receive further feedback from a broader audience and get into the detail of certain aspects. Just as a reminder, the Nature Future Framework has the 3 corners that were described by Enrique before: nature for nature, nature for society, nature as culture. Now we will look at how different aspects of the landscape may look like under the 3 corners. So how protected areas should look like under nature for nature, nature for society, and nature as culture. And we will do the same with forest, agriculture, connectivity, urban areas. For those who were at the workshop, we also tackled at the workshop energy and fresh water, but we don't have questions for those because we had enough material. And even here, we will have a different number of questions for the different focuses. So we'll just hand over to Alessandra D'Alessio for protected areas. Thanks, Alessandra.
Thank you, Carlo. And hello, everyone. I'm going to present first topic, that is protected areas. Starting from the first narrative, that is nature for nature. Here, there is an emphasis on ecological integrity and resilience in selecting protected areas. And the main priority are, on one hand, to improve the Natura 2000, the pre-existing European protected areas network. That means an implementation of conservation measures within and around protected areas. And on the other hand, new protected areas that should cover the 30% of land and sea must account for, especially for irreplaceable sites. Here, protected areas are located away from human population because there is a need to avoid the potential negative impact that human activities can have on nature. This is the narrative of strict protection par excellence, since we have here no management and no intervention in strictly protected areas, and they are focused on most irreplaceable and representative sites that are, for instance, places that are important because they have crucial characteristics or functions, like primary and old-growth forests, or less wilderness areas, or in places that are important in terms of biodiversity, like biodiversity hotspot, or climate refugia that are important for species that to adapt to climate change. In the nature for society, instead, there is a focus on the provisioning of ecosystem services So protected areas aims to maintain these services in as many places as possible. And most important ecosystem services here are carbon sequestration, pollination, microclimate regulation, and soil protection. And in this case, protected areas are located especially where the ecosystem services are needed. Here, the strict protection is not super strict because some activities can be allowed when they contribute to management goals, like, for instance, hunting, grazing, and timber harvesting. In a natural culture scenario, the priority are high nature value farmland and cultural landscapes, such as Sami forests or Carpathian landscapes. And they also include many of the early successional habitats in Natura 2000. In this case, protected areas are located far from human population because there is the need to allow people to access nature. And contrary to the nature for nature scenario, here there is a higher tolerance for human activities and uses, especially when they are traditional or of community community interest, even in strictly protected areas. So to summarize, we have different priority for each scenario that are basically in nature for nature and preserve the ecological integrity and resilience, in nature for society, the provision of ecosystem services, and nature as culture to protect cultural landscape. For this reason, we have the location of protected areas also is also different because we have protected areas far from human in nature for nature, near human population in nature as culture, and in nature for society, they are where ecosystem services are required. If there is no intervention in strict protected areas in a nature for nature scenario, there are instead respectively a moderate or a high tolerance in nature for society, in nature as culture for some human activities. Now it's your turn. We will ask you some more specific question about protected areas. And the first one is, in a nature for nature scenario, what activity would you restrict in strictly protected areas? There are here some examples like hunting, recreational activities. And keep in mind what nature for nature is about the intrinsic value of nature. So go ahead. Motorized recreation. Logging, infrastructure development, great. Okay, infrastructure development is very quite great. Here we are. Hunting, infrastructure, and fishing. Thanks. Okay. Now can move on to second question, that is in a nature for society scenario, what activity would restrict in strictly protected areas? And here, taking in mind that nature for society is about the utilitarian role of nature. Recreational use, very well. Here again, there is There are many answers about infrastructure development, as you can see. Noise, interesting. Let's see what we have here. Again, infrastructure development, activities detrimental to the functional services provided by specific area. There is a comment here, thinking wind turbines as an example. Thanks. Okay, great. I think, okay, thanks. I think we can move on to the next question, last one, about the protected areas, that is about nature's culture. In a nature's culture scenarios, what activity would you restrict in strictly protected areas as well? Sorry. Very loud noise. Urbanization. Okay, also in nature's culture, we have non-traditional recreational activities. Well, intense farming. Oh, sorry. "25 answers. Please go ahead. Roads and rail. We have a few answers again. Urbanization. I'm sorry, I have, yeah, Menti is loading very slowly. I'm sorry about that. I hope you have this chance to answer these questions. Okay, thank you, everyone, for your answers. Now I give you the floor to Nestor Fernandez. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let me see. I think I have control now on the presentation. Thank you, everyone for your contributions. Now we are going to move to a second major block of our research project, which is about connectivity and restoration, two key components of management and how to address conservation policies also in planning protected areas and so on. So what I am going to present first is the bullet points from the narratives that have been discussed in a previous workshop, and then we will get your inputs regarding each of those narratives. And continuing with the three corners of the nature future framework, if we think about connectivity and nature restoration in a nature for nature future, that is in a future where ecosystem processes are the most important priority to preserve and to restore, we could say that, for example, protecting and restoring ecological corridors would be important in the sense that they would allow to support the conservation of species and natural ecosystems together with their ecosystem processes that are associated, for example, to species interactions and interactions of species within ecosystems. Large-scale restoration would be important in this future also, for example, through rewilding in a way that we promote self-sustained ecosystems. Those are ecosystems that are not so much controlled or not so much affected by human intervention. And in this future, another output of previous work in the workshops has been that barrier removal is very important in order, for example, to facilitate species dispersal and the flow of genes through the landscape at large spatial scales. Now, if we go to a future where the priority is that nature serves to society, so this is a nature for society future, we could think that connected ecosystems are important in order to support nature contributions to people. So, for example, pollination services, fishing, provision of recreational areas, and other services that are actually important for maintaining human societies and for human well-being. Now, in terms of restoration, it has been identified that active restoration measures are important, for example, in order to increase the capacity of ecosystems to sequester carbon, or the capacity of ecosystems to regulate floods. And this is particularly important in the context of climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. So this is also connected to the idea of nature-based solutions. It is using nature in order to provide important services for humans. And for example, when it comes in relation to increasing connectivity, some barrier removal measures are important as far as they provide those services to society. Now, the third future, and it's important to acknowledge some of the differences with the purely nature for society futures, is nature as culture. And here it is important, for example, to restore ecosystems that have a high cultural value or high educational and historical importance. And like, for example, agroecological landscapes that in European minds are part of their history and part of their culture. In such a nature as culture scenario, it is also important the generation of green infrastructure, for example, through active restoration measures. And one example is connectivity restoration that brings green areas in peri-urban and urban areas, and also healthy rivers in cities and the surroundings, so that people can actually enjoy and feel connected to those landscapes. So a summary of those contrasts between the three scenarios are, for example, if we are thinking again about connectivity in a nature for nature scenario, so the corridors that we would design are those that allow connecting large natural areas, while, for example, in a nature for society, it could be corridors that are restored in areas that can provide multiple services, different services, not only services for biodiversity, but services for people. And in a nature as culture scenario, corridors would play a role, for example, in agroecological areas where hedgerows provide habitats for pollinators that then increase the pollination services in agricultural areas, etc. Now, for example, if we focus on the how the systems, the ecological systems actually work in a nature for nature scenario, there is a focus on self-sustained ecosystems. So how we facilitate through connectivity and through restoration self-sustained and complex biodiversity-rich ecosystems. In a nature for society, in contrast, the restoration measures would be more around increasing climate change adaptation and mitigation. And then, for example, in nature as culture, it could be giving more green infrastructure that is accessible to a vast majority of people or to more people. And then in terms of removing barriers, for example, in Nature for Nature, in the Nature for Nature scenario, those barrier removal would support population and genetic processes. In a Nature for Society scenario, for example, it would be important to remove barriers that can actually provide services such as flood regulation, carbon sequestration, etc. And in nature as culture, perhaps the barrier removal might not be so important in some places, as soon as those places support other uses such as recreation or traditional uses such as fishing or swimming or etc. So those are the major contrasts in terms of connectivity and restoration. And now we would like to ask you a few questions on how do you think that, how do you see the future under those three contrasting approaches? And the first question that we would like to ask you is about the Nature for Nature scenario. So in such a scenario where self-sustained ecosystems are the focus of conservation, in which areas and in which ecosystems should we implement large-scale rewilding? Okay. Is Menti, can anybody confirm that Menti is working here?
Slow but working.
Okay, so let's go. So we start to see the first answer here. So meanwhile, I will clarify with rewilding, we mean a restoration approach that helps restoring sustained ecosystems and resilient ecosystems, usually over large areas under a lower human influence, so that it provides ecosystem functions in a way that is less controlled by human interventions. So we see here already that rewilding is important in abandoned farmlands, so that actually indeed has a great potential to increase the amount of areas. Also the areas with highest gain potential. Anywhere we can, that is a very, very optimistic and very positive view of rewilding. Rewilding could be also focused exclusively in protected areas, or in the populated areas or regions, which is also related to the abandoned farms. Okay, this is an interesting question here. Rewilding is important in areas more suitable to connect protected areas. So rewilding would be an approach that actually sustains the connectivity between already protected areas or areas that will be protected in the future. Sorry, I think I went to the next slide. And okay, we have 43 answers. I'll give you one more minute and then we'll go to the next question. It's also interesting to see here that rewilding should be implemented in areas with potential for high level of species richness. So this already give us information about where to prioritize according, for example, to the potential for wildlife comeback or for the introduction or promotion of higher species richness. Okay, we are moving now to next question. So in a Nature for Society scenario, this is the scenario where we are protecting nature and restoring nature mostly to provide services to people, yes, nature contributions to people. Where would we locate ecological corridors? So where would we prioritize the distribution of ecological corridors? And for example, sorry. Okay, is the Menti working now?
Yes.
All right. And we see here already along rivers, in wetlands. If you could also like write a very short specification of why, for example, along rivers would be important. So I guess that, for example, in a Nature for Society scenario, implementing corridors using rivers would also contribute, for example, to flood regulation, right? Green belts around cities. This is a very important comment also. Watershed, a lot of fresh water here. Watersheds, rivers and wetlands. Flood prevention, exactly. This is the kind of responses that really help us. So identify which areas together with a reason very shortly of why those areas, where they are needed to guarantee long-term persistence of habitats, species, and services. So this is the idea of multifunctional corridors. Very good. And sorry, because I'm having troubles with my mouse. Going to the right here. Peri-urban and urban areas. And yeah, a lot of this is around wetlands. We have 47 answers. I'll wait for 1 more minute, and then we'll move to the next question. And meanwhile, I would like to tell you also that in addition to the questions that we are collecting today, you will have the opportunity to provide further input after the workshop. We will inform you on the tools that we are using for that. Okay, now, next question is about nature as culture. Nature is part of our culture, and we relate with nature. Yeah, it's a bidirectional relationship. So in this nature as culture scenario, what measures can actually contribute to improved green infrastructure? And with green infrastructure, we are referring, for example, to hedgerows, trees that can provide shade, for example, and then contribute to better microclimate, biodiversity-rich gardens, etc., etc. And there it goes. So please tell us what measures could be implemented in terms of restoration and increasing connectivity between systems that are important in this nature as culture future. Green roofs and walls, more trees everywhere, unmown road bridges. This is very interesting. This is important indeed. This is something that we have lost in many of our European landscapes. Pilgrimage routes, that is a very interesting question. Indeed, there are traditional routes that were usually used as pilgrimage, but also, for example, for livestock migration together with livestock that has been abandoned, and those cultural landscapes are partly lost in Europe. Use organic materials in buildings, network of temporary water ponds, more fruit trees in the streets, trees near roads, and green bridges and underpasses. Okay. So the number of answers is already stabilizing. I'll give a few seconds more, and then we'll go to the next block. Okay, let's go to the next topic. And the next topic is about forests. Yeah, this is more specifically about how do we see the future of forests in Europe. And again, I'll go through the bullet points of the 3 scenario narratives that came out from a previous workshop. And in the Nature for Nature scenario, one of the outcomes was that passive restoration is an important management action in order to enhance the structural, compositional, and functional complexity of forests. So this is about the, again, self-sustained forests that recover themselves with low human intervention. A land sparing approach is preferred. This means that some forests would have a much lower human intervention, but this would require also that other forests are actually intensified so that forestry practices are still happening in those. All growth forests are strictly protected and connected between them, and high fire risk, which is a very prominent risk, for example, in Mediterranean areas, is mitigated by promoting natural grazing, that is grazing by wildlife species. Now, in a nature for society scenario, instead of allowing for self-regeneration of forests, active restoration, active afforestation would be important, but using native species typically. And here again, the goal is multifunctional forests. So those are forests that can provide multiple services at the same time. It is more connected to the land sharing idea. Forests should maximize carbon sequestration, timber extraction, but at the same time also provide a high biodiversity value. And grazing services are promoted using both wild species but also livestock. Finally, in a nature as culture scenario, active afforestation is also important, but usually with species of high cultural value. So sometimes it's not exactly the species that accumulate more carbon, for example, or not in the short term, but still they have people have a very strong relationship with those species. Land sharing prevails with local communities managing forests. Agroforestry landscapes should be expanded in a way that, for example, wooded grasslands are combined, interspersed with forestry areas, and fires are prescribed to support traditional cultural production services, which is a very traditional activity in Europe. So those are the three main narratives, and the contrasts here are clear. So going from the nature for nature angle of complex self-sustained forests to the nature for society, where active afforestation for carbon sequestration and timber production are important. And then finally, nature as culture, where forest composition should be determined by relational values of people with nature. Now, I'm going to ask now 3 questions as before on how the future of forests in Europe should look like. And the first question is, in a nature for nature scenario, what kinds of forestry activities would be allowed? And in this case, you have the option to select among 6 or 7 different options. So for example, tree harvesting would be allowed in a nature for nature scenario. Full wood harvesting, carbon sequestration. Okay, so you can read the answers and then select those management activities that would be allowed in those nature for nature scenario. And one note of caution, unfortunately, Mentimeter doesn't allow us to specify what you mean with other. So when you select other, please be aware of that. But still, as I said before, we will be able to get answers from you later. Okay, so we see here almost a draw between, in a nature for nature scenario, that is, this is the scenario where nature is managed in a way that it is self-sustained and has an intrinsic value. Yeah, so conservation of nature is done because of the intrinsic value of nature. So we can see that there is almost a draw between the purpose of providing wildlife habitats and carbon sequestration, but also it is very important in this scenario for many of you that forests provide recreational activities. It's interesting to see that prescribed fires are part of the nature for nature scenario, even if the definition of this scenario is actually about self-sustained nature, so processes that happen with less human influence. But this is your response. That's totally interesting. Okay, thank you. And now we'll move to the next question, which is very similar, but this time in a nature for society scenario. So please put your mind in a scenario where nature is preserved and restored, or forests are conserved and restored in the future with the idea of providing services to humans. Then in this case, which forestry activities would be allowed? And we see that, that you are selecting almost all of them. And this is very in line with the idea of multifunctional forests, that is, forests that provide all the services at the same time in the same forests, so that those forests are managed in a way that is kind of homogeneous across Europe and under this land sharing concept. But still, I see that there is a little bit of preference now towards recreational activity. It is funny to see now an unimodal relation distribution here. So there is a little bit more of recreational activities. Carbon sequestration is the second, and very close to the wildlife habitat maintenance. Okay, then let's go to the last question of this section. And it is same question for a nature as culture scenario. So in this scenario where actually forests are maintained and restored in a way that people feel closer emotionally and relationally to those forests, what activities would be allowed here? Let's see if there is any difference between this scenario and the one that was before in a nature for society scenario. Again, wildlife habitat maintenance, I think this reflects the high proportion of nature conservation professionals in this workshop. Recreational activities are now taking over as the main activity that would be allowed in those kind of forests. Fuel wood harvesting pops up as the third activity. And yeah, timber harvesting is still a bit lower, but in reality, both activities are related to harvesting. Okay, the answers are stabilizing, so I'll give now the floor to the next speaker, which is going to speak about agriculture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia, and I'm going to talk about both agriculture and urban topics. And we will first see what are the outputs from the previous workshop, and then we will go through the questions to have some more feedback from you. So in a nature for nature scenario, large-scale farming is envisioned except for areas next to protected areas. Highly intensive lands are not only important to meet food demand, but also to avoid impacts on high biodiverse areas that must be protected. In this context, nature-based solutions such as, for example, crop rotation or high-resistant crops to face drought or restoration lands increase to reduce pesticide use and chemical input. Precision farming also increases to optimize both agricultural inputs and outputs and to reduce extra water consumption during irrigation. And overall, a land sparing approach is preferred, which means that woodlands, wetlands, and meadows are restored or created separately from cultivated lands. In a nature first society scenario, co-benefits with ecosystem services is priority. So we still have large-scale farming here, and nature-based solutions increase as well in high-intense systems. But we have also precision farming as well, closer to urban areas, but a mixed approach between land sharing and land sparing, where land sharing involve a patchwork of agricultural lands incorporating natural features, such as, for example, tree rows, hedgerows, and ponds, rather than keeping agricultural lands and wilderness areas separate. In the nature as culture scenario, emphasis is on extensive and traditional agricultural practices and agropastoralism practices with high conservation and cultural values, such as, for example, vineyard cultivation in Tuscany or transhumance in the Sub-Tyrol Alpine region. Large-scale farming get converted into small-scale farming as a form of cultural heritage, and cultivated lands are placed near settlements to reduce and to have a shorter supply chain. In an overall framework of a land sharing approach, organic farming is developed. So to sum up, we can say that in a nature for nature scenario, in a nature for society scenario, we still have large-scale farming and precision farming, but with a different approach, which is land sparing for nature and land sparing mixed to land sharing approach for nature for society. We have to keep in mind that purposes and priorities are different between nature for nature and nature for society. So in a nature for nature scenario, we aim to ecological integrity and resilience, and in a nature for society, we want ecosystem services provisioning. In the nature as culture scenario, tables turn, so we have small-scale farming and organic farming in a land sharing approach. And the main purpose here is to protect landscapes and practices with cultural value. So let's move to the first question, which is, in a nature for nature scenario, what types of agricultural land uses should be promoted? For example, organic or precision farming or high intensity? Okay, none. Okay, so basically we have none and high intensity. I can see this dualism here. But also traditional farmland management measures, sustainable agriculture, okay. So go ahead with the answers. Okay, yes, what I can see here is that in a nature for nature scenario, non-agricultural land use should be promoted or high intensity. Oh no, sorry. Okay, sorry. Yeah, let's skip to the other question. I think that the situation is getting stable now. So let's move forward. Okay, this question is about the nature for society scenario. And the question is, what types of ecosystem services can be reinforced in agricultural landscapes? Keeping in mind that, for example, ecosystem services can be pollination, water provisioning, erosion control. Okay, all seems nice. Okay, pollination is taking the lead. Okay, so pollination. Okay, pollination and all. I think that the responses are stable now, almost stable. But they're increasing a bit, so we can have like 1 minute more, maybe. Okay. I think we should move forward. So off to the next question. which is in a nature culture scenario, what cultural landscapes are important for nature conservation. And here we have some examples like mountain terraces, extensively managed grassland, agroforestry systems, and so on. Traditional agricultural systems, yeah, in Italy we have tons of them. Natural floodplains. Yeah, okay, we're getting so many responses here as well. Depends on the local context. Yeah, traditional biodiversity, agroforestry systems. What is a cultural landscape? Yeah, just keep in mind that when we talk about cultural landscape, we think about we're talking about all the traditions and activities and practices that have cultural values and are really important because, yeah, because they mean something to us, such as, for example, olive trees here in Italy or vineyard cultivation here in Italy. Okay, I think that we should just move forward to the next topic. Yeah, answers are getting stable, kind of. Not to the next topic, sorry. We have one last question here, which is how important is the reduction of agricultural land in each scenario? So we have this low importance on the left side and this high importance on the right side. And here we have these three scenarios. Okay, so in the nature for nature scenario is really important, as I can see here. So in the nature for society scenario, in a nature culture, we can see some equal results for the moment. And of course, in a nature for nature scenario, the reduction of agricultural land is really important. Even though you should think that to save space for nature, maybe some highly intense system could be good, even in a nature for nature scenario. Okay, so the situation here is that in a nature for society and in nature culture, we have equal results, and in nature for nature scenario, we have high importance about reduction of agricultural land. Okay, let's skip to the other topic, which is urban areas. Okay, in a nature for nature scenario, we will have high-rise complex cities to leave space for nature and zero increase in urban sprawl of cities as we can find nature into cities. So people move from rural villages mostly to large cities, but also to regional towns to have less impacts on nature. And we can see how urban green elements are developed inside the cities, such as green corridors, green roofs, or urban farming, like vertical farming, hydroponics, and so on. In the nature for society scenario, we will see a moderate trend in compact cities development, but urban sprawl increases in peri-urban areas and abandoned villages to improve connectivity between society and natural elements, basically for ecosystem services provisioning. Urban green elements, urban agriculture, and nature-based solutions increase here as well to ensure environment sustainability and ecosystem services provisioning. Some example of nature-based solution can be green roofs, permeable parking, sustainable drainage system, cold air flows that can provide with multiple ecosystem services, such as, for example, flood prevention, pollination, shade, insulation, microclimate regulation. Finally, in a nature as culture scenario, we won't have high-rise compact cities anymore, and spaces basically merge with the surrounding landscapes, and people need to reconnect with nature. And this drives them to shift from large cities and peri-urban areas to medium and small settlements in rural areas, favoring the reflourishing of rural villages and small regional towns. We can see also here how urban green areas and elements are improved to protect endangered and culturally important species, but also to embellish the cities by, for example, planting plant species with different flowering time all along the streets. Also, urban gardening is improved with local food production associated with cultural activities. So to recap a little bit, in a nature for nature scenario, we have to keep in mind that our purpose is to seek ecological integrity and resilience, and we can see this flow from rural areas to cities and high-rise compact cities spread, while in a nature-first society, the main purpose is ecosystem services provisioning, and we can see how these moderate compact cities are developed. There is no flow but urban sprawl in peri-urban areas. In a nature as culture, we have different purposes. We want to protect cultural important activities and landscapes, but also species. And we have no high-rise compact cities, and flow is from cities to rural areas. So basically nature for nature and nature as culture are the opposite, and nature for society is in the middle. So let's get to the other question, which is, in which scenarios do you think high density urban areas should be emphasized? And you have a nature for nature, nature for society, and nature as culture. Okay. So in a nature for nature scenario, high density urban areas are important to save space for nature. But right now in a nature for society scenario is taking over. Okay, it seems like the responses are stable, so we can go forward. Yeah, maybe we should go forward. And okay, this is a multiple choice question. So here we have these green elements here: photovoltaic panel, local food production, and rooftop farming, urban greenery of any kind, and zero emission public transportation. And all these elements are for each scenario. So you can find in a nature for nature scenario photovoltaic panels, but also in a nature for society and in a nature for as culture. So the question is, which green elements should be integrated into which scenarios? and you can choose more than one. Okay. Responses are coming. Okay, I can see that in a nature first society, urban greenery of any kind is taking over for the moment. In a nature for nature, we have urban greenery and zero emission public transportation. And in a nature culture, local food production or rooftop farming. Okay, great. Okay, let's just wait for another minute. Yeah, I think that the responses are stable. So thank you very much. And yes, I'll give the word to Carlo.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra, Nestor, and Claudia, for facilitating the input into the narratives. We have now 15 minutes. We can spend answering some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A box. I know that some of the questions have been answered already, but there are unanswered questions that can be answered directly by the presenters or other participants to the NaturaConnect consortium right now. Marit, I think you've chosen a subset of questions.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for posting the questions. So there has been one overarching question about agriculture in the topic of in the nature for nature scenario and what that actually means. So one question was, if a nature for nature scenario prefers large-scale farming apart from next to protected areas, how are corridors, connections between protected areas envisioned? And similar to that, also in the nature for nature scenario on the agricultural topic, how does large-scale farming support integrity and resilience of nature? This seems to be contradictory. So yeah, maybe a question for Piero or Nestor.
So maybe I can answer the first one, and I will let the second one perhaps to Peter or Henrique or Carlo, whoever. So the first one is about, if I understood the question properly, is about what is the role of landscape, large-scale agricultural farming, nature for nature scenario, and how we could see a nature for nature scenario is that you would need to intensify the use in some areas in order to de-intensify human uses in other areas that are more strictly protected. Yeah. So in that case, it might be that the outcome is that some agricultural areas are actually intensified and even perhaps extend and expand, and indeed be more homogeneous. In which case, then of course, it would be very interesting, very important to design properly the distribution of ecological corridors that can actually go through those agricultural areas and connect between the strictly protected areas. This is actually one of the goals of the project. So what are the pathways that could be selected in order to maximize that connectivity also through intensively managed agricultural landscapes? Yeah, that would be my question in case that I understood correctly. Sorry, because I cannot read the question. And the second one, it's yeah, I will pass it perhaps to Peter. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so this is the one on the integrity and resilience in case of large-scale farming. And that one is based on the premise that large-scale intensive farming can spare land for nature. So by farming on a smaller area in an intensive way, there's more land available for restoration to nature. But I think the remark in the question is very good, because one can doubt very much if large-scale intensive farming beyond current levels in Europe is sustainable in any way and would not harm nature by overspill of nitrogen, pollution of water, and creates basically natural islands in a kind of an ecological desert. So one can, it's a big discussion that we cannot resolve now, but one can question the extent to which this kind of sustainable intensification, those paradigms, are possible and how far you can go in this land span. So I see the contradiction that you mentioned as a relevant one that needs to be resolved. Enrique.
Just wanted to jump in here that I fully agree with Peter, what Peter said. In reality, in the discussions on this and nature for nature in agricultural intensive areas, you'll probably see a reduction, a slight reduction of the intensity, because many of the landscapes in Europe, not everywhere, but many of the landscapes are way beyond sustainable intensification levels, and you need to bring some natural elements. But you'd still maintain in this scenario, based on the current work we have done with stakeholders, relatively high intensive areas, although eventually less intensive than the extremes that we see in many landscapes today.
Yeah, okay. And Marika, do you have more questions?
There was another question that is more about the overarching framework and how these scenarios work in the end. Like the assumption of the three scenarios seems to be that they are mutually exclusive. Will one scenario include all options with targets set for each of them, or how will it work in practice for us?
One for Enrique again. Well, several of us can pick it, but Enrique, I think you can elaborate on this. Enrique, are you there?
Yeah. Can you repeat that? I was responding to Yvonne on the chat on the question and then I didn't listen. I'm sorry.
The assumptions of the three scenarios seems to be that they are mutually exclusive. Is that right? And no. Will one scenario include all options with different targets, or how does it work?
Not at all. I understand it sounds like it, but the idea is to provide some contrasting possibilities. Scenarios are always what if exercise. And of course, the real world have always a combination of these three scenarios. That's how it will happen in the real world. But some places may go for more for one than for the other. And overall, you may go for more for the one than the other. What we're trying to provide is alternatives for the future of people and nature, and what would happen. And then we can have a discussion, an informed discussion about future choices for protected areas and for the management of landscapes in Europe. But we do understand that these three perspectives overlap, and they will always overlap in the real world.
Okay, thanks, Enrique. Yeah, we all very much agree with your answer. Marit, do we have more questions?
Yeah, we have so many questions, but maybe one more. Prioritization approach. So this one is for Piero or Jutta. Prioritization approach may involve setting different weights for the different elements that are included in the actual execution of the prioritization. Have you considered to carry out some comparative prioritization runs where nature, ecosystem service, and cultural values are given different weights?
I can take this one. Thanks for the question. Indeed, we are. I mentioned in the Q&A that we have some examples of the past work we've done that I encourage people to read on. The idea there is to use this weight to look at potential synergies and co-benefits of accounting for one facets of biodiversity and seeing the benefits for others that are not planned for, and also looking at sort of a middle of the road approaches where you give equal weight to different facets. For example, giving equal weight to provisioning services as well as different aspects of biodiversity, such as habitats and species that are listed in the directives. So we'll be exploring this and look both at the implication for the geography of priorities, whether you put more emphasis on different landscapes, but also on the co-benefit, as in the actual amount of biodiversity that you protect or ecosystem services that you provide if you do so.
Okay, thanks, Piero. We have 5 more minutes for questions, so we can pick another probably 2 or 3.
There was another one for Piero as well. Are there scenarios considering only the 30% touches or all territories?
All the territories, 100% lands.
So let's have a look if there are some more questions. There was one question in the beginning about nocturnal habitats. So are protecting nocturnal habitats and connectivity through control of artificial light, is that being considered?
So perhaps I can answer to that one. So in the connectivity analysis, we plan to consider different structural elements that can preclude the movement of species, and of course also nocturnal species or species that are affected, for example, by night light intensity, as one of the metrics that we can actually include in the structural connectivity. So yes, this is one of the pieces of information that we are planning to include. To what extent it is still to decide, but yes, some of the species that we are considering also in the project are, for example, bats are nocturnal species. Yeah. Piero, I think he raised the hand. Maybe you want to complement this?
Yeah, no, just to say that also in the prioritization, especially of the areas under strict protection, we could, for instance, use the European Environment Agency Article 17 reports, which give information on which species are vulnerable to light pollution. So we could think of using that to identify which are the areas where we should minimize this pressure on species, and perhaps this could be flagged for strict protection, for example.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Piero and Nestor and Abik for and Peter for the answers. We can probably at this point bring this webinar to an end. So first of all, what are the next steps? After this webinar, we will look again into the chat and see if there is any unanswered question that has been left hanging, and we will answer all of these questions if they're there. Then we will spend most of July in finalizing the draft narratives based also on the feedback of this workshop. And the plan is to submit a deliverable. It's one of our first deliverables for NaturaConnect, which would be a report with the narratives and the context and a lot more flesh than we could show you in these 2 hours of webinar, and that will be a public report, so it will be available to everyone. And of course, we will send you a follow-up email when the report is out, so you can with the link, and you can download and see the outcome of the workshop and the results of your input. You can also provide further feedback after the end of the seminar through this Padlet, this online tool that you can use to add additional thoughts, additional feedback. We will, as I said, we will be working on this in the coming weeks, so your feedback will be incorporated if you do it in let's say between now and the end of July, or mid-July at least. And of course, you can always email us at the email you see there, NaturaConnect@iasa.ac.at. And that said, we all very much thank you for your participation. You can also give us feedback on the webinar. We can always improve, and we will take your feedback into account. Take this for granted. This is the link for providing feedback, and the QR code that you can use to go directly to the page where you can send your feedback. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating and for staying until the very end of the webinar. We are closing with 5 minutes of advance, which is always a good thing. And thanks again. We'll be in touch very soon with you all with feedback. Thanks and goodbye.